day, everyone. My name is Roland, and for those who have never seen me on a video before, I am the head educator for Master Supplements. And on the call with me today, I have Mr. Jeff Thurston, one of our fearless leaders. Jeff, how you doing today?
Fabulous. It's a beautiful fall day. The leaves are still on the trees.
Amazing. And this is how we can be present in all these different places at one time, because last time I checked, you can only be one place physically. I can only be one place physically. So we thought we'd get together and do a talk for everyone. So this way we can share what it is we're doing as a company. And Jeff can spit some of his grandmaster knowledge in the world of bugs, microbes, farming, and the ecosystem of the human body.
All righty, let's get into this thing.
Let's do it, Jeff. Take it away.
Well, my talk is called Total Health and Natural Knowledge. And the acronym here is THINK. We've been so conditioned to just accept so many things that we're told, and we've forgotten a lot of the stories, a lot of the things that we heard of once upon a time. My history is from starting out, at many different businesses and sales in particular. But this is the disclaimer I use for most of my talks, right? I'm a member of the human race. I live on planet Earth, and I owe my health to Mother Nature. She has done a marvelous job, well, up until 100 years ago, maybe, of giving us all the tools that we need to do to be healthy. And we've sort of forgotten a lot of those tools. And when I got out of college and first started working, I started working at this company called National Drug Company. It's in the Poconos. And I was working with, you can see them all highlighted in red, all these different organisms. I spent the first 6 months just getting vaccinated so I could work with these things. And, so like when somebody says, well, there's chikungunya and there is no vaccine for it. Well, I'm sorry, I had one. So I use this to point out, where I started and what I've learned versus what I hear all the time. And I try to discern the difference between the two. I got into flu vaccination. I just quit. I couldn't do it. Got into sales. But I start all my talks with this slide because this is what Mother Nature intends. In a vaginal birth, 90% of our skin is covered with lactobacillus. In a C-section, there's less than 5%. I mean, that's a remarkable difference. And then with breast milk, there is an ingredient called human milk oligosaccharide that is in part determined by the bacteria in mom. And it is absolutely indigestible by a human being. Well, why would it be in breast milk? Other than to feed the bacteria that the baby just got through breastfeeding and through the vaginal birth. So if you look at it in a different light, what we have the bacteria in mom feeding their offspring, and mom is the vehicle. It's a different way of looking at it, but it's the importance of bugs. I'll call them bugs, they're microbes, they're actinomycetes, they're fungi, they're so many different things, but they're all in us and on us and around us, and we need them. My point. These are the books that influenced me. Think and Grow Rich, think positively. Negative thoughts are free, they multiply like rabbits, but you have to work on positive thoughts. Dr. Elaine Ingham wrote a book called The Soil Food Web, which just always grabbed me. And I would wager that there aren't very many of you who have read the book, The Silent Spring. It was in 1962, Rachel Carson wrote this book. 1972, the United States government banned the use of DDT. But if you take that book and you take DDT out and you put glyphosate in there, it's the same book. We simply have not learned. Here's one of my roots, pun intended. This guy's holding a grassland plant, and the roots are 7 feet long. And on all of these roots, there are bacteria, actinomycetes, fungi that are taking the nutrients in the soil down around his knees and his feet and putting those into the plant. The bison, the antelope, the deer, the cow eats that grass, and it gets the nutrition from that grass. But the curious thing is like in your stomach, the microbiome, these bacteria cannot store energy. The energy has to come from the plant or the human. So that's an exudate in the roots that feeds the bacteria. The bacteria in turn bring in most of the nutrients in the soil. Selenium, for instance, there's a sulfur transport system that can be used, but it's 5 times more if there's bacteria in the soil. And on the right-hand side with current farming, we do disturb the soil. We minimize diversity. We minimize soil cover, and we minimize roots. So if you look at this on the right side of that picture where it says agriculture, the roots don't go down a foot. So what about all the nutrients from his ear to his toes? How are they going to get into those plants that are up there that are monocultured? It just doesn't make sense to me. And if you look at what is in the grassland soil, there's 3 tons of bacteria, actinomycetes, and fungi. 3 tons. And there's 900 million acres in the United States that are turned over. Do the math. You know, it's really important. And I throw this in there only because, you know, ivermectin comes from avermectin, which comes from a streptomycete that was found in the soil in Japan, I don't know, 1972, 5-ish. And that company that worked with Merck to develop, and one of the avermectins is ivermectin. And that's where it comes from. And oh, by the way, this paper shows it feeds bifidobacteria. Wow, amazing thing, isn't it? So when I say E. coli, most of you are going to think of a pathogenic jack-in-the-box kind of a thing. If I say Clostridia, you're going to think of C. diff. And when I say Streptococcus, you're going to think of sore throat. Well, typical medicine has been like, we have this beautiful apartment building. It's filled to capacity in one room. There's a bad guy. Well, we just get rid of the building and the bad guy is gone. And that's a lot of what we're doing. But E. coli actually stores T3 and helps balance out and manage that. Clostridia, well, that converts lactate to butyrate into colon at the proper pH, by the way. And Streptococci, the first inhabitants of the oral microbiome, the kind of program the oral microbiome that we have. So if we look at the genetics between the two, and I know you've heard this before, in each of us there's about 11 million non-redundant genes, and many of them are going to encode proteins, and all enzymes are proteins. So you can kind of get the picture of how many enzymes can be produced by our microbiome, whereas we only have 42,000 genes and not that much of a capacity. But the microbiome, or the genetics of the host, is consistent, whereas the microbiome, it can change. And I mentioned the microbiome can't store energy. It's up to the host to store the energy. And by the way, just if you want a copy of this presentation, there are a lot of slides that are here that show you the papers where this information comes from, if you want to get that. Anyway, microbes get their energy from fiber. Fiber does nothing for the human being. It only feeds our microbiome. And the carbohydrates, you know, are usually taken care of in the small intestine, but the fiber part gets into the colon. And the variety, if an enzyme has to have a pocket that it fits in perfectly to work. Right? So if you add one extra fructose unit in here, now there's a gap and it's not going to work. If you put a branch in here, it's not going to work. If you take inulin from chicory, the structure of the inulin differs from the root to the stem, the flower, and the leaf. So you may have as many as 10,000 different fiber combinations that we eat, and we may need as many as 6,000 enzymes to break them down. Where are they going to come from? It's pretty simple to me. And here's a listing of all the different kind of fibers, but the only things that we really know that we do: trehalose, sucralose, malto-oligosaccharides, lactose, non-resistant starch, etc. One quick comment on trehalose. It's absolutely necessary for a grasshopper to jump, a shrimp to flick, but they figured out how to make it out of corn, and they put it in a lot of processed foods that are either heat or cold processed to maintain structure. And Dr. Britton at the University of Baylor found out that trehalose makes C. diff more toxic. So not to say don't eat it, but if you have a patient who has C. diff, it might be a good idea to look at the foods that they're eating, because they may be getting a little bit of trehalose. And then we have some other interesting things about, like, fecal bacterium prausnitzii. If you eat apple pectin, it increases. If you eat orange pectin, it decreases. And here's one fiber that's been around for a while. The research papers show that it increases bifidobacteria, and it decreases, and it also increases butyrate levels. So we went into our lab and we found out if we took the sugar out of MRS broth and we put in partially hydrolyzed guar gum, nothing grew. So some other organism or some enzyme had to have an impact on it first. Then bifidobacteria will increase, but bifidobacteria don't make butyrate, they make lactate. And lactate is converted to butyrate in the colon, mostly in the transverse colon, by eubacteria and Clostridia, but only at the proper pH. So if the pH is 5.2, there's going to be almost no conversion of lactate. At pH 6, most of it's going to be converted to butyrate. In between, there's ranges where it can get some propionate, etc. But when you increase butyrate, you increase colonic health, you get a greater level of mucus, and that's where akkermansia grows, and akkermansia then can have an impact on obesity and immunity and things of that sort.
And Jeff, I just wanted to jump in here for a second. For those who haven't necessarily seen the patterns that exist from the beginning of your talk up until now, this ecosystem concept is very similar to what you were describing with, modern agriculture versus, wild grass and things of that nature. I think it's really important to point out that we can get very deep into the science of things to understand how they work, but we still need to be able to hover over as health professionals to see everything that's going on in the bigger picture and figure out how it all interconnects. Would you say that's something that's kind of a message you're trying to convey?
Sure. I mean, we've been saying for a very long time, food is our best medicine. But if that food is processed, not going to happen. And B, if it's not grown well, it's not going to have the nutrients that it needs to have to be functional. It all ties together.
Yeah, and that pattern will also transfer over to the inside of a person and their biochemistry and the dysfunction that will result from a lack of consideration of this point. So I think it's a really important thing to hit home as a health professional and a clinician, that you have to understand that everything is interconnected, from the food your client eats to the internal chemistry that they're trying to resolve. The ecosystem analogy really does hold true.
Right. It's the little things that count. And this is just a general picture. I don't know anybody that looks like that, but generally speaking, your stomach pH has got to be in that 1.5 to 3 range. And interestingly, that the pH of the small intestine is about 7.2 until it crosses the ileocecal valve and it drops to 5.5. But again, that we're going to get to this a little bit later. A lot of that depends on the foods that you eat. So if we're going to talk about probiotics here, which are foods that we eat, anybody who's really, really healthy can take just about any probiotic. And if it gets through their stomach, then they're going to be able to get these widespread effects in the blue box down there, short chain fatty acids and, competitive exclusion of pathogens and things of that sort. When you get up into species level, so that's like the word acidophilus, part of Lactobacillus acidophilus, you're going to get vitamin synthesis and some more enzymatic activity going on. But there's a group of people that many are coming to you because they have really rare, really difficult to diagnose issues. And that's where you have to get into strain-specific knowledge to know what you're doing and what you are giving. Because some people just don't do well with probiotics. Some probiotics, they do better with other ones. So when we talk about competitive exclusion, these are just general numbers, but if E. coli reproduces in 20 minutes and Lactobacillus replicates in 90 minutes, in 6 hours, you have 18 generations of E. coli. You only have 4 generations, maybe 5 of Lactobacillus. So you can see that from a 1-to-1 ratio at one point, one's going to have 250,000 and the other one's only going to have 64 organisms. So how are you going to outcompete something that's growing that much faster? And that's one of the reasons why we need to have so many billions of CFU in a capsule to make any kind of a change. Because as Roland said before, you and I can't occupy the same space at the same time. And that works in the microbial world too. Right? If you've got a bug in the wrong spot, it's got to be pushed out. Now, this was some information that I always found very interesting that showed how few bacteria make it through the stomach acid. And I was kind of curious as to why they went to just a 2 to 3 log reduction, except that if you have 1,000 and you lose 3 logs, you have 1. So you've lost 999. So stomach acid is really, really harmful to getting these bacteria through the stomach. And if the pH of the stomach is too high, 4 from too many antacids or whatever, it's not going to have that same impact. But that same impact applies not just to probiotics, but other bugs that we're breathing and swallowing every day. So there's different ways that you can kind of get through the stomach. And one of them is using DR caps, where they just take a capsule, they put gum on the inside. And when it gets into the stomach, it's going to stay for quite a while. But there's a tendency sometimes for them to open up in the stomach. So when that happens, there's still some loss there, but it's much better than not having any at all. And then it comes out, and then you still have to deal with pancreatic juices and things of that sort of bile. Another option is sodium alginate, that just is purely a function of pH. And sodium alginate becomes alginic acid and forms a shell, and bacteria can be buffered, comes out, takes a little while for it to go back, but now you have a polysaccharide gel. And if you remember, likes dissolving into likes, biofilms are polysaccharides. This is polysaccharide, so there's different ways that it can be beneficial to get through the stomach. And then all these bacteria, they're grown in a fermenter, they're washed, centrifuged out, they're dropped into liquid nitrogen, and they're freeze dried. So they're really, really, really fragile. Now, a spore has a different system. They'll get through the stomach, but they need certain conditions to become vegetative. And it's in the vegetative state is the only way that they work. They don't work as spores, they work as vegetative. And bile salts can limit a little bit more converting from the spore to the vegetative state. But anyway, we found that if you were growing these things in a fermenter, polysorbate 80 was absolutely critical for them to thrive. So we found that if you to find a substitute that you could use instead of polysorbate 80, well, sunflower lecithin and oleic acid do the same thing. All that does is reconstitute the cell membrane and allows the organism then to start to grow, bring in nutrients, and output metabolites much faster. And you can add it to most probiotic preparations out there, and you can see that there's an increased amount of growth, and there's an increase in the amount of lactic acid that's being produced. And you can see on the slides in the next one that there's obvious difference. To be fair, the red lines can catch up at 24 hours or 36 hours. But if you have a patient who has diarrhea, guess what? In 24 hours, most everything you put in your mouth is gone. And they really didn't have an opportunity to take off and get going so quickly. So if we move on from here, when we look at papers and how they're referenced, I have a little pet peeve here. If the paper references a culture collection and an isolate, but let's just say there's the one here, ATCC 14917. You can go look it up. You can see the genetics. You can see what it can do. But almost all organisms are on the label, they'll say Lactobacillus, Acidophilus, NCFM. NCFM is a trademark. It's owned by one company, licensed to a company, and only one company can put that on their label. But many companies can buy that organism, but you really don't know what's going on. So, to get understanding what you're giving your patient, it's important, A, to have the strain, but to know what that strain is, not just a trademark. And here's for instance. These are both pictures of Lactobacillus acidophilus. The one on the left is smooth like a hot dog and goes through you just as fast. The one on the right has glycocalyx and all those little pili sticking off on the edge there. They will help grab divalent ions and allow them to adhere to epithelial cells in the lining of the gut. One may be a much better organism than the other. And two strains of Acidophilus, one will inhibit Salmonella, the other will inhibit E. coli. And they're different, and they're so very close in almost every other physical condition except this. So biodiversity helps you with that. Now, getting into some very specifics. This particular acidophilus will degrade oxalates. It produces TNF alpha, interferon gamma, which we know are inflammatory cytokines. It produces some D negative lactic acid. And I've highlighted that one, and this is not a common occurrence. It's rare, but for your rare patient that you can't figure it out, if they can't metabolize D negative lactic acid, what are they going to get? Gas, bloating, brain fog, fatigue. What does that fit? Short bowel, SIBO, chronic fatigue. There are some situations where people can't do that. I think LabCorp does a test. I think Mayo Clinic does a test. It's not an expensive test just to find out if they can't, it's a urine test, if they can't metabolize D negative lactic acid. And if they can't, why would you give them this organism? It's just but you have to get the information. This one also will lower histamines, tyramines. And the real story on this one, I'll go do it real quick, is Dr. Marvin Speck isolated this from a 2-year-old's diaper in the early 70s. And way back then, when you did work on something, you needed to have it verified by somebody else. So they sent the same test up to, I think, Purdue and University of Wisconsin, and they replicated the study. So then they said, well, we need to grow this bacteria. Well, where would you go? Cheese culture. So they went to Chris Hansen's. Bob Sellers was the head microbiologist, and my partner was his protege. So he's been growing this bacterium since the early 1970s. And NCFM stands for North Carolina Food Microbiology. That's where the acronym comes from for that. So, and Bifidobacterium animalis subspecies lactis BIO7, you can see the culture collection number up on the top. This one is a very interesting product because it has an awful lot to do with different immunoglobulins and improving those kind of things. But again, it will degrade oxalates. And point on that is B. lactis is the organisms that will degrade oxalates. B. brevi, B. infantis, they're not going to degrade oxalates. And if you put those two together, you get a significant improvement in runny nose, cough, and fever in healthy kids. And you can see from the study that was done, the improvement went from almost 10% to almost 60% in reducing the incidence of runny noses. So Bacillus subtilis, this is fun. These organisms are around. You know, babies, after they get the bifidobacteria from mom and they're going through the whole thing in their first 2 or 3 years, they crawl around on the ground and they eat dirt. The dog licks them in the face, whatever, they're getting Bacillus subtilis. It's a very, very, very common organism in the ground. Right? And they purify, they grow it. It has a lot of benefits for human health. It's part of most of us, part of our microbiome. But if you're giving it as a probiotic to somebody and you don't know which strain, one's going to increase TNF alpha, the other one's going to decrease it. One's going to increase interferon gamma, the other one's going to decrease it. If you have an inflamed patient, are you willing to flip a coin as to which one you're going to give them? Roland, I don't see that that's a real likelihood that anybody's going to want to do that.
When you can know, it's probably better to know, because strategic decisions usually are more well thought out decisions in the clinical context, because what we're talking about here is also widespread research, which is great. It gives us a guiding light. But when a patient is in front of you, as all the clinicians here know, everything changes. And that's when N=1 becomes just as, if not more important when it comes to clinical decisions.
Perfectly well said. And these organisms can be quite specific. So this B. coagulant, if you've been taking it for a month and you're challenged with an adenovirus, you get a 250% increase in TNF alpha. You get a 1700% increase in TNF alpha from influenza A, but there's no effect for any other influenza. Look, these organisms are very specific. So again, what does this speak to? Biodiversity. You need to have a very diverse microbiome to have the maximum benefit of what you want to do.
It also comes back to the ecosystem concept too, right? Because sometimes the host needs its little support system to raise inflammation to help take care of something that is threatening both the host and the ecosystem of the microbiome, specifically the microbes that live within the microbiome. And this is where the dynamic nature of balance and complexity and coming together really, I think, hits home in my opinion.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. This one, I point this one out because this one is going to be more pushing things onto the TH1 side, but it can be isolated up to 8 weeks after you stop taking it. So if people say they don't stick around, they're transient. Yes, they are, but it can be a long time that takes to flush them completely out of the system. Most people get in the first 3 years of life, they're going to get a microbial fingerprint, and they're going to want to go back to that fingerprint no matter what happens. Even with a fecal transplant, people, you give from an obese patient into a thin patient gets heavier because of the transplant, change the bug, but in 6 months later, they pretty much go back to where they were before. This one we've used forever and ever and ever, and this one is really pushing everything over into that Th2 side. It is really an important organism in products that are going to help reduce inflammation. It's interleukin 10, and that's the direction of this organism and several others. But you can put together products, for instance, that are going to have this and the NCFM. Well, one's going to help with that inflammatory response to get things going, but this one's going to help with bringing that inflammatory response back down to where it belongs, because everything needs to go up and down and up and down. You don't need to go up and stay up, and that's where too many of us are at this time. And this is just a little quick, that dendritic cell up on the top doesn't know what it wants to be when it grows up until it's influenced by cytokines. And those cytokines influence other cytokines, but they also work on the two different sides of your immune system. And a probiotic can be designed to do this. You can also do a probiotic that's designed only on the Th1 side. You can do a probiotic that's aimed only at the Th2 side. I don't know, to me, that it needs to be one for boys, one for girls, and one for young people, one for old people, because microbiomes are microbiomes, and yes, there are different hormones that influence things, but to me, these are the areas where probiotics can be most impactful. And by the way, putting Lactobacillus plantarum and bifidobacteria in a hot car on a long trip, the windows don't go down, the radio doesn't play, there's no headphones, there's no stereo, no cell phones, no iPads. The kids get there, but it's not the greatest of journeys. And sometimes
that's the way I used to travel.
I know. Which one were you? The guy with the car in his hand, or the one that's screaming, "Get away, get away"?
Oh, I was never the agitator, ever. Promise.
Okay. Anyway, so these organisms, to me, it's like energy. If you have things that are, fighting in that sack, that it's not quite as good as if it's all kumbaya. And you can see there's just plating the different organisms on a bifidobacterium, and not only plantarum doesn't get along with bifidobacterium, but Streptococcus thermophilus doesn't play well in the sandbox with anything that we found. It doesn't play well with NCFM, doesn't play well with others. So that's one that you can get it, and take it, and it'll do wonderful things. Just where you put it, when you take it, to me, makes a big difference. And this kind of information is out there. There's a bunch of strains on the top, and there's different physical characteristics. And this is just information you can gather from reading papers and see what these things do. And you can see that some are really good at getting through the stomach. Some will degrade oxalates. Some, like amoxicillin, will knock them all out. So if you're going to give a probiotic to a kid, double up on a probiotic. It's just a little bit of information can go a long way in kind of picking what you want to do with it.
Yeah, this is where knowledge is as power from a clinical perspective, because I think we should always bring it back to that is essential, but also the understanding of context and how to fit these things in to make your patient care a little bit more personalized and a lot more strategic, in my opinion, personally speaking.
All right.
Jeff, you would never do this to your digestive system, would you?
Oh, only on Friday nights.
I thought you were a two-plate of nacho kind of guy.
Yeah, well, I can't eat that much anymore anyway.
Well, here's the thing, though, right? Because we assume what we eat always gets digested just because you start chewing it and swallow it. But depending on what you eat, that might not always be true.
So let me ask you a question. Which is better, a poor diet properly digested or a proper diet poorly digested?
For your overall health, I would go with option A, because the downstream consequences of poorly digested organic eggs and various other food compounds that are healthy in theory, but in practice possibly get incompletely broken down, stimulate the immune system, possibly drive dysbiosis and cause leaky gut, I'll take my McDonald's burger perfectly broken down in this case scenario,
So,
notwithstanding long-term nutritional deficiencies. But to your point, it illustrates a very powerful message that without digestion, nothing really matters.
so as we age, we produce less stomach acid and we produce fewer enzymes. So the older you get, and it's just part of aging, our ability to digest food, even a proper diet or an improper diet, starts to diminish. And the worst is to have a poorly digested poor diet. But anyway, so it is a little bit about what you eat, but let's just assume that if your patients aren't drinking Coca-Cola or Pepsi or Mountain Dew and eating French fries and ice cream, because they're never going to get better. We all know that. So it's not always what you eat, but what you digest. So you have to have good stomach pH. Pepsin works only in that range, 1.6 to 3. And if you don't have pepsin working on proteins, when they come out, trypsin, chymotrypsin aren't going to have the ability to work as well as they could. And you're going to get undigested proteins into your colon, and you're going to get putrefactive anaerobic bacteria growing. That's the way it works, folks. And so you need to have that complete digestion. So you need to have a pH of 1.6 to 3. But it's not only what you digest, but what you assimilate and eliminate. So if you're eating proteins, you need the amino acids, you need the minerals, you need the energy, but you got to get rid of the waste. And this is where fiber and prebiotics and probiotics all will work well to manage the terrain. But to me, a missing piece has always been most people have some leaky gut. They're getting proteins into their bloodstream. You got to take care of that. That's where a lot of inflammation is coming from. And so if you take a systemic enzyme, you can help that. Now, in the food that you eat, it's really important to understand what it might do to the pH of the body, because we don't talk about pH enough. It's critical in all parts of our body and how they function. So a lemon is as alkaline as baking soda. But you think, well, it's really sour and acidic. Yes, until it breaks down, and then you have all these calcium and magnesium ions, which are alkaline. So if you look at this chart, you can look at the different foods. And oh, by the way, if you look at the protein column, it comes all the way down to neutral before you find anything listed. So everything in the protein world, other than what you're going to get from plants, is going to be alkaline, but the proteins are all going to be acidic. At the very bottom, you'll see is about the worst thing you can put in your mouth. Anything from bacon and sausages and cheeses and colas are going to be very acidic, which are going to help, lower the pH in your colon, which is going to reduce the conversion of lactate to butyrate, and which is going to lead to ill health in the colon because you don't have that butyrate food source for the colonocytes. Surprise. So, Roland, we've talked about this a lot. All the clinicians and doctors at this conference know that it's their job is to find out what the problem is. Right? I mean, that's why you go to them. You're not feeling well. They're the ones they have the knowledge and the skills and the testing and everything else to find out what's wrong. But your patient says, you fix me. And really, it's the thumb. They have to point it themselves. They need to be involved in their care. I mean, you know this better than I do, but we talked about this in one of the master classes that we did. If mom swears, I'll never drink Diet Coke again, she promises you that. I promise you, right? But dad and the kids have it in the refrigerator all the time. Do you really think that she's going to be able to comply with that? The temptation's too great.
Human willpower is only so strong sometimes.
Exactly.
And it's really, from a clinical perspective, it's a two-way street, because if your clients are paying you good money to solve their problem, but all they're doing is putting their arm out and you apply a Band-Aid to their cut, they're not necessarily stopping to think why they keep getting cut. And metaphors and analogies can be great teaching tools. I think the ultimate thing here is to pick up the responsibility as a clinician side to understand what to look at and how to look at it, and then how to apply it strategically. But the patient needs to follow through, because the best plan laid out without compliance or execution is really just a fancy piece of paper with some cool information and some good knowledge on it. Jeff, you wanted to add some more value to this whole thing. I think these are two great links that you can maybe just briefly touch on.
Yeah, the first one is really just thinking about water. I mean, we talk about alkaline water, we talk about rehydration and everything else, but how water functions, there's some really interesting things here that, when you get into quantum physics, things change. They're not the normal things that we see every day, but there are things that are going on with water in the cell and how it functions. It actually functions as a battery in the cell and giving you energy. And it's really important. And then the second one is on the cell danger response. And we're going to talk about that a little bit coming up. Actually, Roland, you're going to talk about it a little more than I
Yeah.
do.
As I take a sip of my water.
Right. The cell danger response is, if you're, Dr. Balkavich says it this way, is that if your child is over on a high chair playing with the Cheerios and you're over at the stove, cooking something and something threatens your child, you're not going to take the time to take the thing off the burner, turn off the stove before you go over. You're going to go over and take care of the child, make sure it's safe and healthy. Well, if you take too long, you're going to have a fire in the kitchen. And if you take even much longer, you're going to have a fire in the house. So the whole thing is that cells have the same response that everybody does: fight, flight, or freeze. And if that cell is challenged, it's not going to want to eat and it's not going to want to reproduce. So, a lot of things begin at the cellular level. And so to that point, I'm going to ask Roland, to look at the next slide and say, this is how things are thought.
Well, yeah, and I will do that. I just want to touch on that last statement that's on this slide, because the most powerful thing as a clinical provider of sorts across all spectrums of the practice of health and medicine is the concept of perspective. We as an industry have gone very nitty-gritty into deep details of the minutia of various things when it comes to the ceremonial naming of a collective set of symptoms that we eventually call the disease. And then we're fighting a monster. And the thing that we've really been trying to do over the last year is bring the perspective about to understand the source of origins of many things that have similar patterns, that have different manifestations of the end result. So whether you're working on Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, or you're working on type 2 diabetes, believe it or not, there's more in common with those two scenarios than there are differences. But what we see them as are very different things because of the name, where they manifest in the body, and the symptoms that the client is presenting that we're trying to reverse engineer. Because this is really us. And I don't mean to reduce us, because Jeff spent so much time building up the interconnected complexity of the human body and how it's connected to the earth and nature, and it's all one concept. But we as the organism on the right-hand side, generally we have a little bit more skin, but the organism is built with a group of organs that interconnect called organ systems. And those organ systems have specialized organs that perform essential functions to maintain our health and sustain our life. But those organs are comprised of different combinations of tissues, which there are 4 main tissues in the body, but all tissues are cells at the end of the day. And there are only so many different kinds of cells. So if we have a sick organism, we have dysfunctional organ systems because we have weak organs comprised of compromised tissues, which are essentially nothing more than sick cells. So if we're looking at how to reverse engineer everything, we have to understand that this is the ecosystem of health. And when we're dealing with a client or a patient who has been struggling for a period of time, it's like a little bit of a storybook. Their life story has been given clues as to how long their cells have been functional or dysfunctional. And the illness is what we're trying to figure out, not by overwhelming the illness and willing it to die, but understanding what the body is unable to do in terms of restoring balance, and working with the body via our clinical acumen, our knowledge of how to use strategic supplementation, and not neglecting food, diet choices, lifestyle, emotions, all the things that make up the person, because we're not just organisms. We also have personalities, we have likes, we have dislikes. And the real art and science of patient care is being able to know how to reverse engineer something for someone and help them find balance for the context of who the person is and how they need to be worked with. And that's where real success comes. Because systemic inflammation is really, in my opinion, at the cause of most chronic degenerative diseases we see today. Take away acute things of injuries, falls, car crashes, what have you. All diseases of dysfunction are connected to inflammation. And that inflammation started somewhere. So if we go back to the beginning of Jeff's talk, if someone came into the world via cesarean birth, amen for the modern, miracle of science, but that person is now behind the eight ball when it comes to the diversity of their gut microbiome. And if they weren't breastfed enough or they didn't get the proper immune stimulation and education via microbiome development and breast milk, well, then that immune system is going to be primed for inflammation. And maybe they have a recurrent strep infection that's never cleared. So there is an initial stimulus that's driving a response in someone. And as Jeff also mentioned, via what's called the cell danger response, there are processes that intervene that the body tries to heal itself, and it doesn't always have the ability to do so. So the cessation and the resolution of inflammation never gets taken care of. So the body is a walking compensation machine because it's incredibly designed to survive and procreate until it can't. And from a clinical perspective, we want to understand that when someone's not getting better with what we're doing, we're not flipping the switch in the immune system to silence an inflammation so it stays on. And in some cases, it elevates because the human body is very inherently lazy and it likes patterns. If the body knows that there's an inflammatory insult and you need inflammation to heal, your genetics will epigenetically re-regulate to make you better at raising inflammatory processes and cytokines. So you're stuck in this healing crisis. And the end result is really what you see in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide: aging, degeneration, various developments of illnesses. So what you have to understand is the ecosystem analogy in this whole presentation comes full circle. We need to understand what the body's trying to do. And when we understand what the body's trying to do, we have to help it along rather than overwhelm it, because the body makes no decisions by accident. Once we have dealt with the proper source of origin, the body can deal with all those upstream re-regulations of silencing inflammation, helping to regenerate the tissue, then getting back to normal health and vitality. And what this looks like from a patient perspective is the clearing up of their symptoms, the improvement of their physical body habitus, the enhancement of energy and metabolism, and hopefully prolonged health span, because in my world, health span and lifespan are not the same thing. So I thank you, Jeff, for adding a little bit at the end there.
One quick thing, though, if you go back to the last slide, we're in the little green box on the left-hand side there on the bottom, that's where drugs, supplements, herbs, oils, and things of that sort can be a help to get you over the hump. Sometimes you need a little bit of a push to get moving in the right direction, but they're not designed for the most part to be long-term, take this forever kind of things. If you stop the insult, your body can take care of itself. We can just help you. So anyway.
Well, good point there, because the name supplement has been synonymous with fix, and It is exactly what it's meant to be, a supplement that provides a signal that the body can intake and interpret to help resolve the issue that you're just aforementioning, where we have yet to figure out what the initial insult or the sustained insult actually is. And that's the key to outcomes of success, because no one got sick from drug deficiencies.
Exactly. So now I want to say total health and natural knowledge. Thank you.
There we go.
Very much your time. And hopefully there's one little nugget in here or two that gets you to think and do something and maybe help one of your patients or clients.
Jeff, thank you for your time, your knowledge, and your wisdom. This was a lot of fun. And everyone, thank you very much for being present, for attending the conference and listening to what it is we have to say. Hopefully you enjoyed it and would like to see you at some point in the near future.